Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the R Programming for Beginners series. Now, so far in this series, we have been using R to calculate values, to store data in different types of data structures like vectors, lists, matrices, and data frames, and we have been using those data structures to perform different operations. Now, we have been doing all of that, but up until now, everything that we have done runs line by line. That is, the program runs without thinking and without taking any decisions. And in today's episode, we are going to discuss about something that allows R to make those decisions. So, in today's episode, we are going to be discussing about control statements, or let's say conditional statements, in R. Conditional statements help R react differently depending upon a situation. So, in order to discuss about them, without further ado, let's get started with the video. So like in every other video, let's have a basic introduction first. What is a conditional statement? Or let's say, what are conditionals? Well, conditional statements are statements that execute different tasks based on whether a given condition is true or false. So if we have a condition, depending on whether that condition is true or false, a conditional statement can tell R what action to perform. Let's say we have a condition. If that condition is true, the conditional statement can tell R to take path A, whereas if it is false, the conditional statement can tell R to take path B. So that is what conditional statements are. And now that we have the basic knowledge about what conditional statements are, let's learn more about them by knowing what core conditional keywords are there in R. So R gives us a few simple keywords to handle decisions. And among them, if statement is the most basic. It runs code only when a condition is true. That is, if a condition is true, it will run some code. Next up, we have the if-else statement, which adds a second option for when a condition is false. So it helps us choose between two outcomes. That is, if a condition is true or if a condition is false. Next up, we also have the else-if, which helps us to check several conditions one by one. And finally, we have the nested if condition, which allows more detailed decision making inside another condition. So inside an existing condition, we can hide another condition. And if you are confused about some of these keywords, you don't have to worry at all. That's because we'll see the examples of all of these step by step later on in the video. So before we get into coding, let's understand the logic behind conditional statements. Every conditional statement in R comes down to one simple question. That is this condition true or false? And R does not guess. It evaluates the condition, gets either true or false values, and then decides what to do. If the condition is true, the code inside the code block will run. That is, the code will execute. And if it is false, the code is skipped. Or R moves to another option like the else block. So this is the basic logic behind it. And now that we know the basic logic, let's look at the syntax of the if, else if, and else block. So this is the basic knowledge that you require in order to know about conditional statements. That is, first we will have the if keyword as discussed before, and inside a pair of parentheses there will be a condition. We'll have to check if this condition is true or false, and if this condition is true, the code inside this code block, which is defined by this pair of curly braces, that is, this curly brace and this curly brace, will enclose a block of code, and if this condition is true, this block of code will execute. But what if this condition is false? Well, if you have an else if block, we can add another condition that we would want to check. So else if another condition is true, execute this code block that is defined by these curly braces. And we can keep adding else if blocks to add condition after condition, and after all of the checks are finished, if none of these conditions are true, we will have to execute the else block. After we define the else block with the else keyword and a pair of curly braces, we can add code to be executed if none of the conditions above match. So that is the gist of it. We have the if keyword. If condition is true, execute this. Else if this condition is false and this condition is true, execute this code block. And if none of these conditions are true, execute this code block. So that is how the if, else if, and else structure work. So now that we know about the syntax, let's get into our compiler and start coding, shall we? So now that we are inside of the R compiler of Conditional.com, let's first of all execute the basic if statement. So in order to demonstrate how an if statement works, I'll first of all create a variable x and then store a value of 10 inside of the variable x. And then after that, we will define our condition, that is with the if keyword and a pair of parentheses, if, and then inside of our parentheses, we will have the condition to be defined. So if x is greater than 5, and then a pair of curly braces, and inside this pair of curly braces, we will have to define the code block that we want to execute, or let's say we want R to execute when this condition is true. So if x is greater than 5, let's print something out. If x is greater than 5, print that x is, small x is greater than 5. Now what will happen is when we run this program and this condition inside of the parentheses is true, R will execute this block of code defined after the if statement. So in our case, it should print out x is greater than 5. So this is it. So let's say our x value is 4 and we run our program, nothing would happen and this code block would be skipped entirely because this condition is not true at all. X is not greater than 5. So that is the basic if statement for you guys. Now for the if else statement. Let's say we want the program to at least output something, right? We can't just output nothing. So we would add a else block. And an else block comes in handy when you want at least something to be outputted whenever the condition is false. So if this condition is true, this will be outputted. But when the condition is false, that is else, let's say print and then a pair of parentheses, x is smaller than 5. So if our condition is true, this block will execute, else this block will execute, that is this code block right here. So since our value is lesser than 5, that is this condition is not true, our else block will execute and it will execute this block of code, that is it will print out x is smaller than 5. So that is how the basic if else statement works. Now let's have a practical example. Let's say we have to define a condition for a person to vote. That is, we will first of all, let's say the age of the person is 16 and we have to define a condition. Let's say the person can only vote if his or her age is greater than or equal to 18. So if your age is greater than or equal to 18, what would happen? We'll print out you can vote. Else we will have to print out you are too young to vote. So in this case, what would be outputted? Since this condition is not true, that is our age is not greater than or equal to 18, in fact it is less than 18, this else block would execute, as you can see. But if this age were to be 20, this condition would be true. That is, our age is greater than or equal to 18. That is, 20 is greater than 18. So this block would execute. It will print out you can vote. And that is how the if else block works. Now, what if you want to add multiple condition checks? That is where the else if block comes in. Else if. So let's remove this example entirely. And let's say we want to check the score of a student and grade that student based on the score. So first of all, we will define the score variable. And let's say the student has a score of 72. Now, inside of our condition, first of all, let's check if our student is eligible for an A grade. So if score is greater than or equal to 90, the student will obtain a grade of A. So let's say we will print out grade is A. Now what if the student gets a score of below 90? We want to define a condition for that as well. So else if the score is greater than or equal to 75, we will define another code block to execute if this condition is true. That is, if our score is greater than or equal to 75, let's say the student will get a grade of B. That is another condition. And let's say we want to add yet another condition, that is C grade. So else if the score is greater than or equal to 50, let's say the student will get a grade of C. So the grade will be C. And if none of these conditions are true, that is if the score is not above or equal to 90, above or equal to 75, or above or equal to 50, that is none of these conditions are true, finally we will define an else block to execute if none of the conditions are true. That is, let's say the student fails. So print grade F. Now what will happen when we click on run? First of all, we will see that the score of 72 will be stored in the value of score, or the variable of score. And first of all, our program will try to check for the first condition. That is, it will check if the score is greater than or equal to 90. And since it is not greater than or equal to 90, it moves on over to the second check, that is this else if block. It will check after this check of more than or equal to 90, our program will check if the score is greater than or equal to 75. In our case, that is not true as well. So it will once again move over to the third check. That is the third, or let's say the second else if block. And since our score is greater than or equal to 50, this block of code which corresponds to this condition will execute. So it will print out C. Now let's say our score is 40. Now since none of these conditions are true, that is score is 40, so none of these conditions, that is 50, 75, 90 are true, our else block will run, since none of these conditions are true. If none of the conditions that we defined up are true, our program will fall back to the else block. So it will print the grade is F. So that is the basic gist of if, else if, and else. So just a quick reminder, R starts checking conditions from the top to bottom. So it starts checking condition from the top and gradually moves towards the bottom. So if it finds that a condition is true, so let's say our score is 90, it will stop checking the condition as soon as it finds one condition to be true. That is, if our first condition is true, R will not even check all of these conditions. Since our first condition is already true, it will execute this block of code and skip all of this entire rest of the block, or let's say rest of the else if and else conditions entirely. So in our case, once it finds out that the score is equal to 90, it will execute this immediately and then skip the rest of the code blocks. And that is why the order of the conditions matter. So let's say I say score is greater than or equal to 75. That is, I check that the score is greater than or equal to 75. If our score is greater than or equal to 75, we'll get a B grade, and if our score is greater than or equal to 90, we will get an A grade. Now even though we have gotten a 90, R will check this condition first, since we have defined this if block first, and then it will give us a score of B. Because as soon as it finds a true condition, because 90 is greater than or equal to 75, it will give us the value inside of this code block. So even if we have 90, our grade will still be B. So that is why the order that you define these conditions will matter. We want to properly prioritize our conditions in order to avoid this error. So in our case, we have defined first of all the check for A grade first, since we want to know if the student has gotten an A grade or not. So now that we know about the if, else if, and else pattern, let's move towards the final topic of our video, which is nested if statements. So nested if statements, and this basically means if statements inside if statements. So I'll explain to you guys what this means with a simple example. Let's say we have a variable called number, and this holds a value of 12. Let's first of all check if this number is greater than 0, that is if this number is positive, and if this number is positive, let's check if this number is even. So if, first of all, this is our first condition, if our number is greater than 0, that is if our number is positive, let's print out that this is a positive number. So print positive number. So after we know that our number is positive, let's also check if our number is even. So inside of this code block of the if statement, let's define another if statement. If our number is perfectly divisible by 2, so if you remember from our previous episode of operators, this is the modulus operator, which checks the remainder of our number divided by 2. So if our number divided by 2 leaves no remainder, that is our remainder is 0, we can safely say that our number is even. So print and it is even. So what did we do? First of all, we checked if our number is positive or not, that is if our number is 0. And after we checked if our number is 0, let's say after we confirmed that our number is 0, we also checked if our number is even or not. That is, we nested this if condition inside of this if condition, and that is what nested if statements mean. You use one condition inside another condition, that is, you double check conditions basically. So let's run this, and we will find that it is a positive number and it is even. Now what if we type out 11? Now this will obviously be true, so it will print out positive number, but this condition, that is our 11 divided by 2, will not leave a remainder of 0. This condition won't execute. So it will only print out positive number. And that is how if statement, or let's say nested if statements work. You define one condition inside another condition. So that was it for this video. Let's have a quick recap of our slides. So as a recap of today's topics, today we learned about all of these concepts. That is, we learned about the if statement, which executes code only when the condition is true. Next up, we learned about the if-else statement, which provides two possible outcomes based on the condition. So that is, when the condition is true, it will execute the if block, and when the condition is false, it will execute the else block. And after that, we also learned about the else if condition, or let's say the else if statement, which tests multiple conditions in a sequence. And finally, we also learned about the nested if statement, which handles complex and multi-level decision logic. So I hope all of these concepts were clear to you guys. And next up, we will be working with loops inside of R. So don't forget to tune in. If you liked this video or found this video helpful, please drop a like and subscribe to our channel for more such videos. And until the next episode, bye bye and happy coding.